The Paul Amadeus Dienach Chronicles, a man who woke up in the future. In 1921, a Swiss-Austrian teacher named Paul Amadeus Dienach fell into a year-long coma after complications from tuberculosis. When he woke in 1922, he appeared physically recovered but psychologically transformed in ways his doctors couldn't explain. He began writing obsessively, filling notebook after notebook with detailed accounts of what he claimed to have experienced during his unconscious year, except he hadn't experienced nothing or darkness or the blank void that coma patients typically report. According to Dienach, his consciousness had left his body in 1921 and woken up in the body of another man, living in the year 3096 AD, over 1,000 years in the future. For that entire year, while his physical body lay comatose in a hospital bed in Geneva, his awareness had been living a future life, experiencing a world that humanity wouldn't reach for another millennium, learning about technologies and social structures and historical events that hadn't happened yet, but that he now remembered as if he'd lived through them. When his consciousness returned to his own time and his own body, he was left with complete memories of that future year, knowledge of what would happen to humanity over the next 1,000 years, and the burden of information he couldn't prove, and that most people would dismiss as elaborate delusion or fever dream, rather than genuine temporal displacement of consciousness into a future reality. Dienach knew he was dying. The tuberculosis that had caused his coma would kill him within a few years, and he had no time to waste trying to convince skeptics that his experience was real. Instead, he focused on documenting everything he'd learned, writing detailed journals about the future he'd witnessed, describing it in terms his 20th century perspective could understand, while struggling with concepts and technology so advanced that he lacked the vocabulary to properly articulate what he'd seen. The journals described a world utterly transformed from his own time. No more nations in the way he understood them. No wars or conflicts of the type that had recently torn Europe apart in World War I. A global civilization that had transcended many of the problems that plagued humanity in Dienach's era. But the path to that future was anything but peaceful, and the knowledge he brought back included warnings about catastrophes and transformations that humanity would have to survive before reaching the enlightened state he'd witnessed. Before his death in 1924, Dienach entrusted his journals to his student in Greece, George Papachazis, asking him to translate them from German to Greek and to share the knowledge with those who might understand its significance. Papachazis initially thought the journals were a novel, an elaborate science fiction work his teacher had been writing. Only after Dienach's death did Papachazis discover the claim that the contents were actual memories from the future rather than fiction. He spent decades studying the journals, eventually publishing them in Greece in 1972, under the title Valley of the Roses, where they became underground classics in Greek metaphysical circles, while remaining almost unknown in the broader world. The text described in extraordinary detail a future history spanning from Dienach's time to the year 3096, covering wars and technological revolutions and social transformations that would reshape humanity completely, culminating in a society that had achieved what Dienach could only describe as a higher state of consciousness, where humans had evolved beyond their current limitations into something greater. The future Dienach described began with darkness before reaching enlightenment. The 20th century would be catastrophic. He foresaw another world war even more devastating than the first, conflicts that would threaten human survival, technologies emerging that could destroy civilization. The 20th and 21st centuries were periods of crisis, where humanity teetered on the edge of extinction through nuclear weapons, environmental collapse, and social breakdown. But somehow, civilization survived these trials, and in the centuries following, humanity began to transform. The nation-state system collapsed, replaced by global governance that actually worked because it emerged organically from necessity, rather than being imposed by conquest. Technology advanced to points where material scarcity became obsolete, where energy was abundant and clean, where disease and aging were controllable, if not entirely eliminated. But the most significant transformation wasn't technological. It was consciousness itself. Dienach described that somewhere around the year 2400, humanity underwent what the people of the future called the Great Realization, a species-wide shift in awareness where large numbers of people began to experience consciousness differently, to perceive reality in ways that transcended normal sensory experience, to access information and states of being that previous generations would have considered supernatural or impossible. This wasn't religious rapture or mystical ascension, but rather an evolutionary development, the next stage in human consciousness that had been latent in the species and that environmental conditions and deliberate efforts finally activated. By the time Dienach's consciousness arrived in 3096, this enhanced consciousness was normal, and he found himself in a body and society where people could do things with their minds that would seem like magic to 20th century humans. The society of 3096 operated on principles that Dienach struggled to explain to his contemporary readers. Work as he knew it didn't exist. Automation and advanced technology handled material production, and humans engaged in pursuits that were creative, exploratory, and developmental, rather than subsistence-focused. Education consumed decades of each person's life, not because they were learning job skills, but because they were developing consciousness and capacity, becoming more than their baseline human nature allowed. People lived centuries rather than decades, their bodies maintained by technologies and practices that Dienach couldn't fully comprehend, but that had turned aging into a manageable condition rather than an inevitable decline toward death. Government as Dienach knew it was absent. There was global coordination and decision-making, but it functioned through consensus and shared consciousness rather than through representatives and voting. When humanity needed to make collective decisions, those with developed consciousness could merge awareness temporarily, accessing a form of group mind that allowed understanding of all perspectives simultaneously, making decisions that reflected genuine collective will rather than majority overriding minority. This social technology, this ability to temporarily unify consciousness for decision-making, eliminated many of the conflicts that plagued earlier eras because decisions weren't made by forcing one group's will on another, but by finding solutions that actually integrated everyone's needs and perspectives. Crime and violence were essentially non-existent, not because of punishment or enforcement, but because the consciousness shift had altered human nature at a fundamental level. The drives that created conflict, territorial aggression, resource competition, status anxiety, had been transcended or redirected into channels that didn't harm others. People still had individual desires and goals, but the framework in which they pursued them had changed so dramatically that behaviors Dienach's era considered inevitable. Parts of human nature simply didn't occur anymore. Murder, theft, assault. These belonged to humanity's past, to the consciousness state that people in 3096 had evolved beyond. Dienach described being treated as a medical curiosity during his time in the future. The man whose body he'd woken into had been in a coma, and when Dienach's consciousness from the past animated it, the people of the future realized something extraordinary had occurred. A consciousness from 1,000 years ago, years earlier, had somehow projected forward through time and inhabited one of their contemporaries. They studied him gently, interviewed him about his era, and helped him understand theirs, treating the situation as a rare opportunity to understand humanity's past through someone who'd actually lived it. They were kind, but also somewhat horrified by what Dinach told them about the 20th century, about the wars and poverty and limited consciousness that characterized his time. From their perspective, he was from humanity's dark age, from the period before the transformation, and his memories confirmed how far they'd come from that primitive state. The people of 3096 had access to historical records from all eras, but they understood that recorded history distorts and simplifies, that having someone present who actually experienced the past provided insight that documents couldn't capture. They asked Dinach about emotional states, about how it felt to live in a world of nations and wars, about what consciousness was like before the Great Realization. His answers apparently filled gaps in their understanding of their own history, confirmed some things, and contradicted others, gave them personal testimony about an era they knew intellectually, but couldn't fully comprehend experientially. The question of how Dinach's consciousness traveled through time was never fully answered to his satisfaction. The people of the future theorized that his near-death state during the coma had somehow freed his consciousness from its normal temporal anchoring, allowing it to drift forward along his timeline to a point where a suitable vessel, the comatose man in 3096, was available to receive it. This kind of temporal consciousness displacement was rare, but not unknown to them. They had records of similar cases throughout history, instances where consciousness seemed to slip between times, during states of profound physical distress or transition. They couldn't control or replicate the phenomenon, couldn't send him back deliberately, but they understood it as a natural, if uncommon, occurrence when consciousness became untethered from the body. When Dinach's year in the future ended, when his consciousness returned to his own time and body in 1922, the transition was instantaneous from his perspective. One moment, he was in 3096. The next, he was opening his eyes in a Geneva hospital with doctors and nurses celebrating his emergence from the coma. But he brought back memories of an entire year lived in the future, knowledge of humanity's trajectory, awareness of what was coming and what humanity would have to survive before reaching the enlightened state he'd witnessed. The burden of this knowledge was immense because he had no way to prove it, no way to demonstrate that his experiences were genuine rather than elaborate coma dreams or neurological misfiring. The journals he wrote were his attempt to preserve the knowledge, to leave a record that might be useful to future generations, even if his own contemporaries dismissed him as delusional. He described technologies that wouldn't be invented for centuries, social structures that would seem impossible to people in the 1920s, evolutionary developments in human consciousness that his era had no framework to understand. The text is remarkable for its consistency and detail, for the coherence of the future world it describes, for the careful thought given to how society would function under conditions so different from the 20th century baseline. Skeptics point out that Dinach's future is suspiciously utopian, reflecting the hopes and dreams that someone from the aftermath of World War I might project onto a distant future rather than realistic prediction of how humanity would develop. The absence of specific technological details that could be verified, the focus on social and consciousness developments that are unfalsifiable, the convenient fact that most of what he describes wouldn't occur until long after anyone reading the journals would be alive to check, all suggest that the journals are either conscious fiction or elaborate confabulation produced by a damaged brain during extended unconsciousness, rather than genuine memories from the future. But defenders of Dinach's authenticity note elements of his account that don't fit the standard wishful thinking pattern. He doesn't describe the future as perfect. There are still challenges and conflicts, just operating at higher levels than his era understood. He includes warnings about catastrophes that humanity would face, some of which seemed implausible when he wrote them, but that subsequent history has made more credible. His description of the Great Realization as an evolutionary shift in consciousness, rather than religious salvation or technological transcendence, is unusual for his era, more aligned with concepts from Eastern philosophy and modern consciousness studies than with the prevailing Western religious or materialist frameworks of the 1920s. The question of whether human consciousness can actually travel through time, whether Dienach genuinely experienced what he described, or whether the journals represent elaborate fiction or trauma-induced hallucination, can't be definitively answered unless the future he described actually arrives and can be compared to his account. We're still centuries away from 3096, still experiencing the early stages of the trajectory he outlined, unable to confirm or deny the specific details of the society he claimed to witness. But some elements of his account have proven prescient. He foresaw global governance emerging from necessity, technological developments that would transform society, consciousness research becoming legitimate science rather than dismissed mysticism. Whether these are lucky guesses or genuine memories from a future he actually visited remains contested. The journals remain obscure outside Greece, never achieving widespread attention in the English-speaking world despite their remarkable content. They exist in a liminal space between fiction and prophecy, between dismissed curiosity and potentially significant testimony about humanity's future. For those who believe Dienach actually experienced what he described, the journals are a roadmap showing where humanity is headed, the trials we'll face, and the transformation awaiting us if we survive. For skeptics, they're interesting science fiction written by a dying man with tuberculosis who spent a year in a coma and emerged with damaged cognition that produced elaborate false memories he genuinely believed were real. What makes the Dienach Chronicles different from other claims of time travel or prophetic vision is the specific mechanism, not physical time travel or mystical revelation, but consciousness displacement during coma, a phenomenon that, if possible, wouldn't require exotic physics or divine intervention, but rather represents an edge case of consciousness studies, a rare occurrence when awareness becomes untethered from its normal temporal position. If consciousness isn't strictly produced by the brain, but rather filtered or focused through it, then damage to the brain or near-death states might temporarily release consciousness from its usual constraints, allowing it to drift temporally before reconnecting to the body when physical conditions stabilize. This framework makes Dienach's claim slightly more plausible than traditional time travel stories because it doesn't require paradoxes or machinery or violation of causality. His consciousness observed the future but couldn't change it, couldn't interact in ways that would create grandfather paradoxes or bootstrap paradoxes. He was a passive observer experiencing a year of the future through a borrowed body before returning to his own time with memories that he then spent his remaining years documenting. The future continued on its predetermined path unaffected by his visit, and the past remained unchanged except for one man gaining knowledge he couldn't prove, and that would mostly die with him except for journals that would reach limited circulation decades after his death. The prophecy or prediction aspect is where the journals become testable, though on timescales that make verification difficult. Dienach describes specific developments in coming centuries, when certain transformations would occur. What events would mark turning points in human history? How consciousness evolution would manifest? As time passes and we move through the centuries he documented, his account will either be validated or falsified. If the Great Realization happens around 2400 as he described, if society develops along the trajectories he outlined, if the specific markers he mentioned appear when he said they would, then the probability that he actually experienced what he claimed increases dramatically. If instead human history diverges completely from his account, the journals remain fascinating fiction or delusion, but lose credibility as genuine testimony from the future. Paul Amadeus Dienach died in 1924, 3 years after his coma and 2 years after documenting his alleged future memories. He never lived to see any of his predictions come true or be falsified. He never witnessed the Second World War he'd foreseen, never knew whether humanity would survive the 20th century crises he'd described, never learned whether his student would even translate and share the journals, or whether the knowledge would be lost. He died with certainty that he'd experienced something extraordinary, with memories of a year lived 1,000 years in the future, with knowledge of where humanity was headed if it could survive the journey, and with the burden of being unable to prove any of it to a world that would mostly dismiss him as confused or mentally damaged by his year-long coma. The journals remain preserved in Greek translation, available to those curious enough to seek them out, describing a future that's either genuine memories from consciousness displaced through time, or the elaborate imaginings of a dying man's damaged brain creating meaning from chaos during extended unconsciousness. They describe humanity transcending its current limitations, evolving into something greater, surviving catastrophes that would threaten extinction, and ultimately achieving a state of consciousness in society that seems impossibly utopian from our current vantage point. But that Dienach insisted he'd witnessed firsthand, that he'd lived in for a year, that he'd experienced with the same visceral reality that any of us experience our daily lives. Whether he actually did, whether consciousness can travel through time, whether his journals are testimony or fiction, prophecy or delusion, won't be definitively known until the future he described either arrives as he documented it or fails to materialize, until humanity either undergoes the great realization he witnessed or remains forever trapped in consciousness, states that he characterized as primitive and limited compared to what we're capable of becoming, until 3096 arrives and we discover whether the world that exists then bears any resemblance to the world that Paul Amadeus Dienach claimed to have visited during his year-long coma in 1921. When his consciousness allegedly left his dying body and woke up in the far future, living in tomorrow for 365 days, before returning to his own time with memories that would die with him. Except for the journals, except for the chronicle of the future, written by a man who claimed he'd been there, who insisted until his death that he'd seen what was coming, who documented humanity's future for anyone willing to consider that maybe, impossibly, a man in a coma really can wake up in the future and return with knowledge of what awaits us. Knowledge that sits in those journals, waiting to be proven true or false by the only test that matters. The passage of time itself carrying humanity forward toward the year 3096, when we'll finally know whether Paul Amadeus Dienach really did wake up in the future, or whether he was just a dying man dreaming of what might be, hoping for transformation, imagining enlightenment, and leaving behind a testament to either genuine temporal consciousness displacement or to humanity's eternal desire to believe that we're destined for something greater than what we currently are, that the future holds transcendence rather than extinction, that if we can just survive the trials ahead, we'll become something remarkable, something he claimed he'd already seen waiting for us 1,000 years from now. The Philadelphia experiment, men fused with metal and lost in time, in October 1943, according to claims that emerged over a decade later, the U.S. Navy conducted a classified experiment at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard involving the destroyer escort USS Eldridge, attempting to achieve radar invisibility through application of Einstein's unified field theory, using massive electromagnetic generators to bend light and radar waves around the ship. making it undetectable to enemy surveillance. But something went catastrophically wrong with the experiment, and instead of merely becoming invisible to radar, the ship allegedly vanished completely from its berth in Philadelphia, teleported instantaneously to Norfolk, Virginia, over 200 miles away, where it was briefly observed before vanishing again and reappearing back in Philadelphia. The entire incident lasting only minutes, but leaving the crew in conditions that suggested they'd experienced something far beyond simple teleportation. Sailors were reportedly found fused with the metal structure of the ship, their bodies merged with bulkheads and decks, as if the matter of flesh and steel had somehow interpenetrated during whatever dimensional or temporal displacement occurred. Others had caught fire and burned without apparent ignition source. Some had simply vanished completely, never accounted for, possibly lost in whatever space the ship traveled through. Survivors suffered severe disorientation, psychological trauma, and reported experiences of time distortion, of seeing things that shouldn't exist, of briefly existing in states where normal physics didn't apply, where their bodies became unstable and reality itself became fluid, leaving them permanently damaged by exposure to forces or dimensions that human biology isn't equipped to handle. The Navy has consistently denied that any such experiment occurred, has stated that the USS Eldridge wasn't even in Philadelphia at the time of the alleged experiment, has dismissed the entire story as fabrication and myth. But the claims persist, supported by testimonies from people claiming to have witnessed the event or to have been crew members who survived the experiment, creating one of the most enduring legends of secret military technology gone wrong, of government experiments that ventured into territory where physics becomes uncertain and where the consequences of failure include not just death, but violations of physical law, transformations of human bodies into impossible states, and psychological damage from experiencing reality in modes that consciousness cannot process without breaking, leaving the Philadelphia experiment hovering in that space between conspiracy theory and documented history, impossible to verify but impossible to completely dismiss. A story that, if true, represents one of the most significant and horrifying military disasters ever concealed, and if false, represents one of the most elaborate and persistent hoaxes in paranormal history. A narrative that has spawned books and films, and endless debate about what actually happened or didn't happen to the USS Eldridge and its crew in October 1943. The origin of the Philadelphia experiment story traces primarily to Carl Allen, also known as Carlos Allende, a former merchant marine who in 1955 sent letters to Morris K. Jessup, an astronomer and UFO researcher, claiming to have witnessed the experiment from his own ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth, which was allegedly docked nearby when the Eldridge disappeared. Allen provided specific details about the experiment, about the electromagnetic equipment involved, about the effects on the crew, about the ship's teleportation to Norfolk and back. His letters were strange, filled with unusual capitalization and underlining, written in a style that suggested either mental instability or deliberate obfuscation, making it difficult to determine whether he was reporting genuine classified information or whether he was confabulating or intentionally creating an elaborate hoax. The story gained wider attention when an annotated copy of Jessup's book, The Case for the UFO, was sent to the Office of Naval Research, marked up with handwritten comments that appeared to be from multiple people discussing secret Navy experiments, UFO propulsion systems, and other classified information. The annotations mentioned the Philadelphia experiment and seemed to corroborate Allen's claims through independent sources, though the handwriting analysis later suggested the annotations might all have been written by Allen himself, using different pens and styles, creating the illusion of multiple annotators, when actually it was a single source creating the appearance of corroboration. Morris Jessup died in 1959 under circumstances officially ruled suicide, carbon monoxide poisoning in his car. But conspiracy theorists have long suggested he was murdered because he knew too much about the Philadelphia experiment or other classified programs, that his death was disguised suicide to prevent him from revealing what he'd learned through Allen's letters and his own investigations. Whether Jessup's death was genuine suicide motivated by personal problems, or whether it was assassination remains disputed. But it added a layer of sinister implication to the Philadelphia experiment story, suggesting that knowledge of the experiment was dangerous, that authorities would kill to protect the secret. The specific claims about what happened to the crew are the most disturbing elements. Reports describe sailors whose bodies had merged with the steel structure of the ship, men embedded in bulkheads, or decks. Their flesh and bone interpenetrated with metal in ways that shouldn't be possible, in ways that suggest the atomic structure of different materials had somehow blended, or that the men had been partially phased out of normal space-time and rematerialized while occupying the same location as the ship's structure. The accounts describe attempts to extract these men from the metal, efforts that were either impossible or that resulted in their deaths, leaving bodies permanently entombed in the ship's structure or requiring amputation of the fused sections. Other crew members allegedly experienced spontaneous combustion or immolation, catching fire without apparent external ignition, burning from the inside out in ways that suggested their bodies had been affected at molecular or energetic levels by the electromagnetic fields, or by whatever forces were involved in making the ship disappear and reappear. Some survivors reportedly suffered from freezing, suddenly becoming stuck in position, unable to move, as if time had stopped for their bodies while continuing for everything around them, requiring intervention from crew members who understood the phenomenon and who could somehow restore normal temporal flow to the affected person. The psychological effects on survivors were allegedly profound and lasting. Men reported seeing dimensions or realities beyond normal perception, experiencing time non-linearly, existing simultaneously in multiple states, perceiving the ship and themselves as fluid rather than solid, as probability rather than certainty. These experiences reportedly drove some to madness, to suicide, to permanent psychiatric institutionalization, because their consciousness couldn't reconcile what they'd experienced with normal reality, couldn't return to baseline human perception after having been exposed to states of existence that violated every assumption about how reality is structured. The theoretical basis for the experiment supposedly drew on Einstein's unified field theory work, attempts to create mathematical frameworks that would unite electromagnetic forces with gravity, potentially allowing manipulation of space-time itself through controlled electromagnetic fields. If such manipulation was possible, making an object invisible by bending light around it would be a relatively simple application. But the theory would also allow for more exotic effects, like teleportation, time manipulation, and dimensional displacement. Whether Einstein's work actually provided a basis for practical technology, or whether the military's interpretation and application of theoretical physics produced unexpected catastrophic results, remains unknown because the classification of the alleged project means the actual theoretical and technical details have never been publicly released. The Navy's denials are consistent and absolute. Official records show the USS Eldridge was not in Philadelphia on the dates specified, was actually on convoy duty, and can be tracked through logs and reports that place it elsewhere. The ship's crew logs show no unusual incidents, no missing personnel, no records of experimental equipment being installed or tests being conducted. The Navy states flatly that no experiment of this type ever occurred, that the technology described wouldn't be possible with 1940s science and engineering. that the entire story is fabrication without any factual basis. But conspiracy theorists note that if an experiment had gone catastrophically wrong, producing the horrific results described, the Navy would have every reason to deny it happened, to falsify records, to eliminate evidence, to relocate survivors to psychiatric facilities where their testimony would be dismissed as delusion, to do everything possible to ensure the disaster never became public knowledge. The fact that official records contradict the story doesn't disprove the story if those records are themselves fabricated or altered to cover up the incident. And some researchers claim to have found inconsistencies in the official records, gaps that might indicate alterations, personnel records that seem incomplete or modified, suggesting that something did happen that the Navy has worked to erase from documentary evidence. Testimonies from alleged survivors or witnesses have appeared over the decades, though their credibility varies widely. Some provide detailed accounts that include technical information and specific memories that seem too elaborate to be purely invented. Others make claims that seem exaggerated or that contradict each other, suggesting either that different people experience different aspects of the same event, or that at least some testimonies are fabricated or embellished. The challenge with testimony about classified military projects is that genuine witnesses would have been threatened with prosecution if they spoke publicly, meaning credible witnesses might remain silent while less credible sources feel free to come forward, creating a selection bias where the available testimony isn't necessarily representative of what actually occurred. The connection to other alleged military experiments is frequently noted. The Montauk Project, which supposedly involved time travel experiments and consciousness manipulation, is claimed by some to be a continuation of the Philadelphia experiment, using knowledge gained from the Eldridge disaster to develop more controlled methods of temporal and dimensional manipulation. Whether Montauk is real or is simply another layer of mythology built on top of the Philadelphia experiment legend is equally disputed. But the connection creates a larger narrative about secret military research into exotic physics and consciousness manipulation that spans decades. The theoretical possibility of what the Philadelphia experiment describes depends on interpretations of physics that aren't mainstream. Making an object invisible through electromagnetic manipulation of light isn't impossible in principle. Modern stealth technology achieves radar invisibility through different means, and theoretical invisibility cloaks have been proposed using metamaterials that bend light around objects. But achieving the dramatic teleportation and temporal effects described would require physics far beyond current understanding, would require that unified field theories provide not just mathematical elegance, but actual mechanisms for manipulating space-time in ways that allow matter to be moved through space instantaneously, or to exist in quantum superposition, where solid objects can interpenetrate. If the experiment did occur and did produce the catastrophic results described, the ethical implications are staggering. Using human subjects in experiments with such uncertain outcomes, experimenting with forces that might violate physical law and produce unpredictable effects on human biology and consciousness, proceeding with tests despite theoretical uncertainties that should have suggested extreme caution, all would represent gross violations of human rights and research ethics. The cover-up, if it occurred, would represent additional ethical violation, denying the victims acknowledgement of what happened to them, preventing families from learning the fates of loved ones, suppressing knowledge that might prevent similar disasters in future experiments. The cultural impact of the Philadelphia experiment story has been significant regardless of its truth. The concept that military research might venture into exotic physics with catastrophic human consequences, that classification allows experiments that violate ethics, that sailors might be used as test subjects in projects they don't understand and can't consent to meaningfully. These themes resonate with broader anxieties about military-industrial power, about secret government programs, about the dangers of pushing scientific boundaries without adequate ethical frameworks or safety protocols. Whether the Philadelphia experiment happened as described, happened in different form that was then exaggerated and mythologized, or didn't happen at all and represents pure fiction that has achieved legendary status, the story endures as one of the most vivid and disturbing narratives about secret military technology, about experiments that ventured into territory where the rules of reality become uncertain, where the consequences of failure include not just explosion or death, but violations of physical law itself, transformations that leave human bodies in states that shouldn't be possible, psychological damage from experiencing dimensions or temporal modes that consciousness can't process without breaking, and cover-up so complete that even decades later, we cannot determine with certainty whether any of it actually occurred or whether it's all elaborate mythology. Fiction that has been presented as fact or fact that has been successfully suppressed and dismissed as fiction, leaving the Philadelphia experiment in permanent uncertainty. A story that might be true or might be hoax, that describes events that might have left sailors fused with metal, might have teleported a destroyer between cities, might have exposed crew members to forces that violated their bodies and shattered their minds, or might simply be the most persistent and elaborate paranormal legend to emerge from World War II military operations, impossible to verify, but equally impossible to completely dismiss, because classified programs, by definition, don't leave evidence accessible to civilian researchers, because cover-ups, if successful, would look exactly like absence of evidence, and because the story itself, regardless of truth, captures something essential about fears regarding secret military experiments, about what might be done in the name of national security, about what technologies might be tested on unwilling or uninformed subjects, about what horrors might be concealed behind classification barriers that prevent public knowledge or accountability, leaving us wondering whether the Philadelphia experiment was real disaster that has been successfully suppressed, or whether it's cautionary fiction that warns about what could happen when military necessity meets theoretical physics at the edge of human understanding, when experiments proceed despite uncertainty, when human subjects are treated as expendable resources rather than as people with rights, when secrecy prevents oversight and classification prevents discovery, creating conditions where anything might happen and where we'd never know because the evidence would be sealed, the witnesses silenced, the records altered, and the truth buried so deeply that decades or centuries later, researchers would still be arguing about whether it happened at all, still be finding fragmentary testimonies and ambiguous evidence that suggests something occurred, but that never quite proves it definitively, leaving the USS Eldridge and its crew suspended in historical uncertainty, simultaneously disappeared and present, simultaneously myth and possible reality. The ship that might have teleported or might have simply sailed routine convoy duty. The sailors who might have fused with metal, or might have served their tours and returned home with nothing more dramatic than the usual wartime experiences. The experiment that might have pushed physics into territory where reality breaks down, or might have existed only in the imagination of Carl Allen and those who believed his strange letters, hovering forever in that liminal space between conspiracy theory and suppressed history, between fiction and fact, between impossible and merely unproven. The Philadelphia experiment that we may never definitively understand, that may remain forever uncertain, forever disputed, forever haunting the edges of military history as a reminder that some truths might be too disturbing to acknowledge, some experiments too catastrophic to admit, some violations of natural law too profound to reveal, leaving us only with stories, with testimonies of uncertain credibility, with official denials that might be truth or might be cover, with the permanent question mark that hangs over October 1943 and the USS Eldridge, and what did or didn't happen when the Navy allegedly tried to make a destroyer invisible and instead made it impossible to determine what's real and what's mythology in the bizarre tale of men fused with metal, ships teleported through space, and reality itself breaking down under the strain of forces that humans perhaps were never meant to manipulate, leaving scars on those who experienced it or on our collective imagination if it never happened at all. The Overtown Bridge, where dogs jump to their deaths. There's a Victorian stone bridge in Scotland, built in 1895, that spans a rocky gorge near the village of Milton in West Dunbartonshire. It's a beautiful structure, the kind that appears on postcards and tourist guides. Ornate stonework arching gracefully above a 50-foot drop to the Overtoun Burn below. People walk across it regularly, enjoying the views of the surrounding countryside and the historic Overtoun house that stands nearby. But dogs, specifically dogs on leashes being walked by their owners, will suddenly, without warning or apparent provocation, leap over the parapet wall to the rocks below. They don't stumble or slip. They don't act distressed or panicked before jumping. They simply reach a certain point on the bridge, usually on the same side and in the same general area, and then they leap deliberately over the edge as if something below is calling them, as if the 50-foot drop doesn't exist in their perception, as if whatever they're compelled toward is worth jumping for despite the physics of the fall and the rocks waiting at the bottom. Since the 1950s, at least 600 dogs have jumped, and approximately 50 have died from the fall. Numbers that far exceed what coincidence or accident should produce, creating a pattern so consistent that locals call Overtoun Bridge the Dog Suicide Bridge, though the word suicide implies intent that we can't confirm in animals, leaving the question of why they jump as mysterious as the fact that they do, creating a phenomenon that has attracted animal behavior experts, paranormal investigators, and scientists trying to understand what specific property of this specific bridge causes this specific behavior in dogs, and only at this one location, suggesting that something about the bridge or the gorge it spans affects canine perception or instinct in ways that override their survival drive and compel them to leap to probable death. The victims are almost exclusively long-nosed breeds: collies, Labradors, retrievers. Dogs with enhanced olfactory capabilities, whose sense of smell dominates their sensory experience of the world. This breed specificity is one of the few consistent elements in an otherwise baffling pattern. The jumps occur most frequently on clear, sunny days, rarely in rain or poor weather. The dogs jump from the same side of the bridge, the right side, when walking from the village toward Overtoun House, and usually from the same stretch of parapet between the last two turrets. These consistencies suggest environmental factors, rather than random psychological breakdown or individual dog pathology. Something about this location, these conditions, this specific stretch of stonework, triggers behavior that appears suicidal, but that might more accurately be described as compulsion toward something the dog perceives below that overrides every instinct to avoid the obviously dangerous leap. Witnesses describe the behavior as sudden and absolute. Dogs that were walking calmly, showing no signs of distress or unusual interest, will abruptly lunge toward the parapet, pulling against their leashes with strength that sometimes tears the lead from the owner's hands. In cases where owners manage to hold them back, the dogs struggle violently, fixated on getting over the wall, exhibiting single-minded determination that's deeply uncharacteristic of normal canine behavior. Dogs are generally cautious about heights and drops. They don't typically leap from positions where they can't see a safe landing. Yet at Overtoun Bridge, this caution evaporates, replaced by overwhelming compulsion to jump that's so powerful it overrides millions of years of evolved survival instinct. The few dogs that have survived the fall and been brought back onto the bridge have attempted to jump again immediately, suggesting that whatever they perceive below isn't eliminated by experiencing the fall, by the pain and trauma that should create strong negative associations with the location. Instead, the compulsion persists, indicating that it's not curiosity about the gorge that can be satisfied by investigation, but rather an ongoing perception or stimulus that continues to affect the dog's behavior, regardless of previous experience. The scientific explanation that has gained most traction involves scent. The gorge below the bridge is home to a population of minks and possibly other small mammals whose scent glands produce pungent territorial markings. The theory holds that dogs with strong scenting ability detect these smells as they walk across the bridge, and the combination of the scent's intensity, the height providing optimal scent dispersal on updrafts from the gorge, and the dog's predatory instincts creates an overwhelming urge to pursue the perceived prey. The dogs aren't committing suicide. They're reacting to what they interpret as huntable prey directly below them, not recognizing or not processing the danger of the 50-foot fall because their olfactory drive has completely dominated their decision-making. This explanation accounts for the breed specificity. Long-nosed breeds with enhanced scenting ability would be more susceptible to olfactory compulsion than short-nosed breeds. It explains why clear days see more incidents. Wind and weather conditions affect scent dispersal, and optimal conditions might create particularly strong scent corridors, rising from the gorge. It explains the location specificity. The right side of the bridge might be where updrafts carry scent most strongly, where the particular geometry of the gorge and the bridge's orientation creates a scent column that affects passing dogs. But this explanation struggles with certain elements. Dogs encounter prey scent constantly, including scents from animals, in positions they can't reach, or in directions that would be dangerous to pursue. Urban dogs smell squirrels in trees, rats in walls, prey animals across busy roads, and while they might show interest or pull toward the scent, they don't typically attempt suicidal leaps to reach it. The fact that overtuned bridge dogs override not just leash restraint, but also the visual evidence of a deadly drop suggests something more profound than normal prey drive response to scent. And the absolute nature of the compulsion, the way it completely overrides everything else in the dog's awareness, seems excessive even for scent-driven hunting breeds. The paranormal explanations focus on the bridge and the surrounding area's history and reputation. Overtown House, which the bridge leads to, has its own dark history involving a tragic death in 1994, when a man killed his infant son, claiming the child was possessed by the devil, before attempting to kill himself by jumping from the house. The combination of this recent tragedy and older local legends about the area being haunted or cursed creates a framework where the bridge might be seen as a location where dimensional boundaries thin, where entities might influence or lure animals, where energy or forces that affect sensitive beings like dogs create the compulsion to jump. In this interpretation, dogs are responding not to physical scent, but to spiritual or dimensional stimuli that humans can't perceive, but that animals detect through senses we don't fully understand. The compulsion would be analogous to how dogs sometimes react to nothing, barking at empty corners, refusing to enter certain rooms, behaving as if they perceive presences that humans don't register. At Overtown Bridge, whatever dogs perceive would be powerful enough not just to disturb them, but to compel them to jump, to override survival instinct in pursuit of or escape from something that exists in layers of reality we can't access. The Celtic history of the region includes legends about thin places where the barrier between the mortal world and the other world is permeable. Overtoun, the area's name, comes from Gaelic and relates to streams and water, elements traditionally associated with transitions and thresholds in Celtic mythology. If the gorge and bridge occupy a thin place, dogs might perceive entities or realms that appear to be accessible by jumping, might see something below that looks like safe ground or open space because it exists dimensionally adjacent to the physical gorge, creating a visual/perceptual mismatch where the dog's sensory input shows them something jumpable while physics shows them a lethal drop. Acoustic explanations have been proposed involving infrasound or ultrasound that humans can't hear, but that dogs detect. If the bridge's structure, the wind moving through the gorge, and the water below combine to create specific frequencies that affect canine hearing, this might produce distress or disorientation that manifest as the jumping behavior. But this theory struggles with why distress would manifest as jumping in a specific direction rather than as general panic or retreat, and why dogs would consistently jump toward rather than away from a distressing sound source. Magnetic field anomalies are occasionally suggested, proposing that unusual magnetic characteristics in the gorge's geology might affect dog navigation or sensory processing. Dogs use magnetic field sensing for navigation, and disruption to this sense might create disorientation that manifests as the jump behavior. However, magnetic sensitivity in dogs is subtle and generally used for orientation over distances, rather than for immediate navigation, making it unlikely that field anomalies would create such dramatic behavioral changes. The veterinary and animal behavior experts who've studied overtuned bridge jumpers haven't identified any common pathology or condition among the dogs beyond the breed correlation. They weren't ill, weren't showing signs of neurological problems, weren't on medications or exhibiting other behavioral issues. They were, by all accounts, normal healthy dogs until the moment they reached that specific stretch of bridge and suddenly became animals willing to jump 50 feet to rocks because something overrode every instinct and training and bond with their owners, compelled them toward the edge with force that couldn't be reasoned with or restrained against. The question of awareness, whether the dogs understand they're jumping to probable death, is philosophically murky. We can't know what a dog comprehends about height and falling and mortality. It's possible they perceive the drop, but simply don't process it as dangerous because whatever they're pursuing or fleeing dominates their decision-making completely. It's possible they don't perceive the drop accurately, that the visual processing, or the scent, or the whatever they're experiencing creates a distorted perception where they believe they're jumping to accessible ground. Or it's possible they perceive everything accurately, but the compulsion is so overwhelming that they jump despite knowing the danger. Not because they want to die, but because whatever is compelling them is more powerful than their fear of death. The owners are left traumatized, watching their beloved pets suddenly transform from companionable animals into creatures possessed by incomprehensible compulsion, pulling free or leaping despite restraint, falling to the rocks while the owner stands helpless on the bridge, unable to prevent or understand what just happened. Many have described feeling that their dog was called by something, that the jump wasn't impulsive, but rather a response to something the dog perceived that the owner couldn't sense. The grief is compounded by the mystery. If your dog had been hit by a car or died of illness, there's tragedy but comprehension. When your dog deliberately jumps off a bridge for no discernible reason, the grief includes profound confusion about who or what your dog was in that moment, what they perceived, why they abandoned safety and bond with you to leap into empty air. Warning signs have been posted. Local authorities and animal welfare groups have publicized the phenomenon, advising dog walkers to keep their pets on short leashes, to use the left side of the bridge, to potentially avoid the bridge entirely if possible. These warnings have reduced but not eliminated the incidents, suggesting that awareness and caution can help but can't completely prevent the behavior when dogs encounter whatever stimulus triggers it. The bridge itself can't be easily modified. It's a listed historic structure, protected as an example of Victorian architecture, and the parapet height is set by the original design. Raising the walls would require permissions that balance historical preservation against animal safety, a bureaucratic process that moves slowly, even as dogs continue to jump. Some have suggested closing the bridge to pedestrians with dogs, but it's a public right-of-way and completely prohibiting. A category of user is legally and practically complicated. The phenomenon has attracted enough attention that Overtown Bridge appears in lists of the world's most mysterious locations, profiled in documentaries and paranormal investigations, studied by animal behaviorists, and addressed in scientific papers attempting to explain the pattern. Yet it persists. Dogs still jump, still die, still provide evidence that something about this location affects canine behavior in ways we don't fully understand despite decades of observation and multiple investigative approaches. Whether the explanation is ultimately mundane, a peculiarity of scent dispersal that creates overwhelming olfactory stimulus that dogs can't resist pursuing, or whether it involves elements we don't fully grasp about animal perception, about how dogs sense aspects of reality that humans miss, about dimensional thin places or acoustic or magnetic effects that science hasn't properly characterized. Overtown Bridge remains as testament to the fact that sometimes locations exist where normal behavior breaks down, where animals respond to stimuli we can't detect or understand, where the patterns are consistent enough that we know something is occurring, but mysterious enough that we can't definitively explain what or why. And every time a dog approaches that stretch of Victorian stonework, every time a long-nosed breed walks the right side of Overtown Bridge on a clear day, there's a chance they'll suddenly detect something, a scent, a sound, a presence, a dimensional bleeding, whatever it actually is. And they'll pull toward the parapet with a force that surprises their owner, with determination that seems impossible for a domesticated animal, with fixation that overrides every other input and every bit of training. And they'll leap over the edge toward the rocks 50 feet below, toward whatever they perceive that we cannot, toward death, or toward something they believe is worth dying to reach, leaving their owners traumatized and confused on the bridge above, leaving investigators and scientists with another data point in a pattern they still can't explain, leaving Overtown Bridge standing as it has stood for over a century, beautiful and historic and inexplicably deadly to dogs who walk across it, who encounter whatever is there that calls to them, that compels them to jump, that creates behavior so consistent across hundreds of animals over decades that we know it's real, even though we still don't know why, still don't know what dogs perceive that we miss, still don't know whether the answer is in biology or physics or dimensions we don't normally access. Still don't know why this bridge, why these conditions, why only dogs, why only certain breeds, why the compulsion is so absolute that survival instinct becomes irrelevant, why dogs jump to their deaths at Overtown Bridge while humans walk across without incident, blind to whatever the dogs sense, unable to perceive whatever calls them from the gorge below, unable to stop them once they've decided to jump, to answer that call, to leap toward whatever waits in the rocks and water and air of that Scottish gorge, where something, somehow, for reasons we still cannot definitively explain, makes dogs willing to die. The mysterious death of Elisa Lam at the Cecil Hotel. In February 2013, the body of 21-year-old Elisa Lam was discovered in one of the rooftop water tanks of the Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, found only after guests complained about discolored water and low water pressure, leading maintenance workers to investigate and discover Elisa's naked body floating in the tank. where it had been decomposing for as long as 19 days, explaining the water complaints, but raising immediate questions about how she had gotten into the tank in the first place, why she was in there, how she had accessed the locked roof, how she had climbed into a water tank that required a ladder to reach and was difficult to enter even intentionally, and why her death was there, in that specific tank, in that specific hotel, the Cecil Hotel, a location with such a dark history of violence, death, and serial killer associations that it had become infamous as one of Los Angeles' most sinister addresses, a place where Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, had stayed during his killing spree, where serial killer Jack Unterweger had stayed while murdering prostitutes, where countless suicides and deaths had occurred over decades of operating as Skid Row Flophouse, making the Cecil a location already heavy with death before Elisa Lam arrived, and making her death there feel less like random tragedy and more like the hotel claiming another victim, another life added to its grim tally. But what made Elisa Lam's death transcend typical mysterious death and become internet phenomenon, become the subject of endless speculation and investigation and conspiracy theories, was the elevator surveillance footage released by police showing Elisa's behavior shortly before her disappearance. 4 minutes of extremely strange activity where she enters the elevator, presses multiple buttons, stands in the corner, then steps in and out repeatedly, appears to be hiding from someone or something, gestures strangely with her hands as if communicating or performing some ritual, peers out into the hallway as if checking for someone, and exhibits behavior that seems either profoundly disturbed, influenced by drugs or mental illness, or terrified of something or someone that isn't visible in the footage, creating video that's deeply unsettling to watch, that has been analyzed frame by frame by thousands of internet sleuths, that has generated theories ranging from mental health crisis to paranormal activity to murder cover-up, making Elisa Lam's death a perfect storm of mysterious circumstances, disturbing footage, sinister location, and ambiguous official conclusion that leaves room for doubt, room for alternate theories, room for the suspicion that something more happened than the official explanation of accidental drowning, complicated by bipolar disorder. Acknowledges, leaving Elisa Lam's death as it remains, over a decade later, officially explained but not definitively resolved, concluded by authorities but questioned by observers, understood as tragic accident by some and as unsolved mystery by others, with the elevator footage standing as permanent testament to her final known movements, to her apparent distress or confusion, to behavior that demands explanation but that resists simple interpretation, making her death one of the internet age's most discussed and debated mysterious deaths, one where video evidence exists but only deepens rather than resolves the mystery, where we can watch her but still don't understand what happened to her, where the footage creates as many questions as it answers, leaving Elisa Lam's death suspended between explanation and mystery, between mental health tragedy and something darker, between accident and possible foul play, between what the authorities concluded and what internet investigators continue to question, with the water tank and the elevator footage and the Cecil Hotel's dark history combining into a narrative that resists closure, that generates endless speculation, that transforms a young woman's tragic death into internet phenomenon, into true crime obsession, into mystery that persists despite official conclusions. Because the details don't quite fit. The behavior in the footage doesn't quite make sense. The access to the water tank seems too difficult. The circumstances seem too strange to be mere accident, leaving Elisa Lam's death as permanent question, permanent mystery, permanent tragedy that happened at the Cecil Hotel, in circumstances that remain disturbing, remain unexplained to many observers' satisfaction, remain the subject of documentaries and investigations, and endless internet discussion, about what really happened to Elisa Lam. The official investigation concluded that Elisa's death was accidental drowning, with her bipolar disorder listed as a significant contributing factor. The coroner found no evidence of physical trauma, no signs of assault, no drugs or alcohol in her system beyond her prescribed psychiatric medications, which she appeared to have stopped taking regularly in the days or weeks before her death, based on toxicology showing lower than therapeutic levels. The conclusion was that Elisa, experiencing a mental health crisis, possibly exacerbated by medication noncompliance, accessed the roof of the hotel, climbed into the water tank, perhaps seeking a place to hide, or perhaps in a confused state, not understanding the danger, and then couldn't get out once inside, dying of drowning with her body remaining undiscovered for up to 19 days until the water quality issues prompted investigation. This explanation accounts for the basic facts, but struggles with several logistical problems. The roof access should have been locked and alarmed, requiring either that Elisa found a way to bypass security, that the alarm wasn't functioning, or that she accessed the roof through a route that didn't trigger alarms. The water tank itself was difficult to access, requiring climbing a ladder and then lifting or removing a heavy lid that was on top of the tank. For someone in a mental health crisis to accomplish this alone seems challenging, though not impossible, particularly if adrenaline and altered mental state provided unusual strength or determination. The nakedness is explained as possibly resulting from paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where hypothermic or confused individuals remove clothing, though Elisa wouldn't have been hypothermic in Los Angeles in February, raising questions about whether this explanation applies. Alternatively, she might have undressed while in the tank for reasons related to her mental state, or her clothing might have come off during her time in the water. Her belongings, including clothing, were found on the roof near the tank, supporting the theory that she undressed before or while entering the tank. The elevator footage is what most troubles observers. Elisa's behavior seems extremely unusual. The repeated entering and exiting, the hiding in the corner, the strange hand gestures, the apparent fear or confusion. Mental health advocates note that this behavior is consistent with severe mental health crisis, possibly psychosis associated with bipolar disorder, particularly if she was unmedicated or experiencing a manic or mixed episode. The gestures might be response to hallucinations. The hiding might reflect paranoid delusions about being followed or threatened. The repeated button pressing might be compulsive behavior, or confusion about how the elevator operates. But other observers see the behavior as suggesting someone was pursuing her, that she was hiding from a real threat rather than from hallucinations, that her gestures might have been trying to signal distress to someone, that her behavior indicates genuine fear rather than psychotic episode. The fact that the elevator door stays open for extended periods during the footage, far longer than it should remain open, has sparked theories about someone holding it from outside the camera frame, though technical explanations suggest the elevator might have been malfunctioning or in service mode. The hotel's security measures and surveillance gaps are significant. The Cecil had cameras in some areas, but not others, creating blind spots where activity wouldn't be recorded. The roof access wasn't continuously monitored by camera, meaning we don't have footage of how Elisa accessed the roof or how she got into the water tank. This absence of complete surveillance creates space for alternate theories. If we could see the roof access and water tank approach, many questions would be answered, but without that footage, we're left with speculation about how a young woman in crisis navigated security measures and accessed a location that should have been restricted. The timing of discovery is disturbing primarily because of the water complaints. Guests were unknowingly using water from a tank containing a decomposing body for up to 2 weeks before the body was found. This has no bearing on how Elisa died, but adds a macabre element that has contributed to the case's notoriety and to the Cecil Hotel's reputation as a cursed location. The internet investigation that emerged around the case represents one of the earliest examples of crowdsourced true crime investigation, with thousands of people analyzing the elevator footage frame by frame, researching Elisa's social media and blog posts, looking for clues about her mental state or her plans, developing theories about everything from serial killer involvement to paranormal activity, to government conspiracy to tuberculosis test coincidence. The last referring to the fact that a TB test is called Lam Elisa, sharing Elisa Lam's name reversed, which led to wild speculation about her death being connected to a tuberculosis outbreak near Skid Row, though this appears to be tragic coincidence rather than meaningful connection. The harm caused by internet investigation in this case is significant. Elisa's family's grief was compounded by online speculation and conspiracy theories. Individuals who appeared in the hotel's surveillance footage, or who were near the hotel, were accused of involvement without evidence, their lives disrupted by false accusations from online investigators convinced they'd identified a suspect. The case demonstrates both the power and the danger of crowdsourced investigation, the power to bring attention to cases and to generate new investigative angles, but the danger of false accusations, conspiracy theory amplification, and the transformation of tragedy into entertainment. The Cecil Hotel's history contributed significantly to suspicion around Elisa's death. The hotel had been site of multiple murders, suicides, and unexplained deaths over its nearly century of operation. Beyond the serial killer connections, Ramirez and Unterweger staying there during their killing sprees, the hotel had been location where people died with disturbing regularity, where violence and drug activity were common, where the transient population and Skid Row location created an atmosphere of danger and instability. This history primed observers to see Elisa's death as potentially sinister rather than accidental, to suspect that the hotel itself or something about the location was responsible, generating theories about curses, about paranormal activity, about the Cecil claiming victims as if it were a malevolent entity rather than merely building with unfortunate history in challenging neighborhood. The mental health angle is crucial and often insufficiently emphasized in discussion of the case. Elisa had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression, was on medication, and based on her blog posts and social media, appeared to be struggling with her mental health in the period before her death. Her trip to California was solo travel that she'd embarked on despite her parents' concerns, suggesting possible manic episode or elevated mood that gave her confidence to travel alone, despite the risks such travel might pose for someone with unstable mental health. The elevator footage, when viewed through mental health lens rather than through mystery lens, shows someone in crisis experiencing symptoms that could be consistent with psychosis, paranoia, or severe anxiety. Symptoms that people with bipolar disorder can experience during episodes, particularly when unmedicated or undermedicated. The tragedy is that mental health crisis appears to have led to a vulnerable young woman accessing a dangerous location where she died accidentally. And this tragic but explicable death has been transformed by internet culture into mystery that obscures rather than honors her humanity, that treats her death as puzzle to be solved rather than as a person's life that ended in terrible circumstances. The conspiracy theories and endless speculation can feel disrespectful to Elisa and to her family, reducing her to an enigma, to an unsolved case, to an internet mystery, rather than acknowledging her as a real person who struggled with real mental health challenges that contributed to her death. The lesson extends beyond the specific case to questions about how we discuss mysterious deaths, how we balance legitimate questions and investigation with respect for the deceased and their families, how we distinguish between evidence-based skepticism of official conclusions and baseless conspiracy theories, how we prevent amateur investigation from causing harm, while still acknowledging that sometimes official investigations are incomplete or incorrect, and that outside attention can be valuable. The Elisa Lam case occupies uncertain space where the official explanation is probably correct, but where the circumstances are strange enough that continued questioning doesn't seem entirely unreasonable, creating a situation where some level of speculation feels justified while also creating harm through baseless accusations and disrespectful theorizing. Whether Elisa Lam's death was a tragic accident resulting from mental health crisis, whether it was something more sinister that hasn't been adequately investigated, or whether the truth lies somewhere between these positions, accepting the accidental death conclusion while also acknowledging that some questions remain about how exactly she accessed the tank and whether any other parties were involved in ways that weren't determined. The case stands as a reminder that mysterious circumstances don't necessarily indicate mystery that requires exotic explanation, that sometimes the most likely explanation is the correct one even when details seem strange, that mental health crises can lead to behaviors and outcomes that seem inexplicable to observers who don't understand the internal experience of severe psychological distress, and that the internet age has transformed how we engage with true crime and mysterious deaths in ways that can be both illuminating and harmful, both bringing attention to cases that might otherwise be overlooked and generating false theories that cause real damage to real people, leaving Elisa Lam's death as it remains. Officially explained as accidental drowning complicated by mental illness, questioned by many who find that explanation insufficient, memorialized through endless internet discussion that ranges from thoughtful analysis to baseless conspiracy theory, and ultimately understood differently by different observers, depending on whether they trust official conclusions or whether they see the strange circumstances as evidence of something more, whether they view the elevator footage as documenting mental health crisis or as showing someone genuinely being pursued or threatened, whether they accept that sometimes tragic accidents happen in ways that seem improbable, or whether they believe the improbability itself suggests that more investigation is warranted, leaving Elisa Lam's death as permanent fixture of internet true crime discussion, as case that won't be forgotten, because the footage exists, because the circumstances were strange, because the Cecil Hotel's dark history makes any death there seem potentially sinister, and because a young woman died in circumstances that feel like they should have been preventable, that trigger our desire to find explanation beyond accident, beyond mental health crisis, beyond the tragic reality that sometimes people die in ways that seem inexplicable, but that are ultimately the result of illness and circumstance rather than of mystery or malevolence, leaving Elisa Lam's memory caught between being honored as victim of tragic accident and being treated as subject of endless speculation, between being acknowledged as person who struggled with mental health and being reduced to internet mystery, between the explanation that authorities provided and the doubts that observers maintain. Suspended as she was in that water tank, suspended between life and death, suspended between known and unknown, suspended in the permanent, uncertain space where her case remains, explained but questioned, concluded but unresolved, tragic but mysterious. A death at the Cecil Hotel that was either exactly what it appears to be or something else entirely, depending on who's analyzing it, who's discussing it, who's trying to understand what happened to Elisa Lam in February 2013 when she disappeared into the Cecil Hotel's dark history, when she climbed into a water tank for reasons we can only infer, when she died in circumstances that official investigation concluded were accidental. But that continued to trouble observers who watch that elevator footage and see behavior that demands explanation. That suggests something more happened than simple mental health crisis, or who accept the mental health explanation, but still feel profound sadness that a young woman experiencing crisis ended up alone on a roof, alone in a water tank, alone in her final moments in ways that feel like failure. Failure of mental health systems, failure of hotel security, failure of circumstances to align in ways that might have saved her, leaving her death as permanent tragedy, permanent mystery, permanent case that internet age has made impossible to forget, that surveillance footage has made impossible to ignore, that strange circumstances have made impossible to explain to everyone's satisfaction, leaving Elisa Lam's death as it will likely always remain. A tragedy that official investigation concluded was accidental, but that observers continue to question, continue to analyze, continue to discuss, making her one of the most discussed deaths of the internet era. One where we have footage of her final known moments, but where that footage only deepens the mystery, only increases the questions, only makes us wonder what was happening in those 4 minutes in the elevator, what she was afraid of, what she was trying to communicate, what happened to her in the hours after that footage, when she somehow accessed the roof and climbed into a water tank where she would die, and where her body would remain for weeks before being discovered, leaving Elisa Lam's death as permanent question about what happened at the Cecil Hotel, about what took a young woman's life in circumstances that remain disturbing, remain unexplained to many, remain the subject of endless speculation that has transformed her death into mystery that persists, that endures, that makes the Cecil Hotel even more infamous than it was before, makes Elisa Lam's name synonymous with internet age mysterious death, makes her case the example of how surveillance footage can document but not explain, can show us what happened but not why, can create evidence that generates more questions than answers, leaving us with the footage, with the water tank, with the questions, with the tragedy of a young woman who died at 21. In circumstances that official investigation called accidental, but that continue to haunt observers who watch that elevator footage and feel that something more happened, something we're missing, something that the official conclusion doesn't capture, leaving Elisa Lam's death as permanent mystery, permanent tragedy, permanent case that remains unsettled despite official conclusions, that remains disturbing despite explanations, that remains the subject of speculation and discussion and endless analysis by people who watch that footage and ask what happened to Elisa Lam, why she behaved the way she did, how she ended up in that water tank, and whether the official explanation is sufficient or whether something more needs to be investigated, needs to be understood, needs to be explained before we can truly say we know what happened to Elisa Lam at the Cecil Hotel in February 2013, when she disappeared and died in circumstances that remain, after all these years, profoundly disturbing, profoundly mysterious, and profoundly tragic. The mystery of closed, time-like curves, time travel's dark implications, in the mathematics of general relativity, in the equations that Einstein developed to describe how space-time curves and warps around mass and energy. There exist certain solutions that shouldn't be possible, that violate our intuitive understanding of causality and temporal progression, but that are nonetheless mathematically valid, perfectly consistent with the laws of physics as we understand them. These solutions are called closed time-like curves, or CTCS, paths through spacetime that loop back on themselves, world lines that return to their starting point, not just in space, but in time, trajectories that, if followed, would bring a traveler back to the moment they departed, allowing them to encounter their past self, to potentially change events that from their perspective have already occurred, to create the grandfather paradoxes and bootstrap paradoxes that science fiction has explored for decades, but that physics suggests might actually be possible under certain extreme conditions. The Gödel metric, the Tipler cylinder, the rotating black hole solutions, multiple frameworks in general relativity permit CTCs, allow for space-time configurations where time travel to the past becomes geometrically possible, where the future can causally influence the past, where the arrow of time becomes circular rather than linear. And this creates profound implications that go far beyond the romantic notion of visiting history or correcting mistakes, implications that suggest the universe might already contain time travelers, that causality as we understand it might be an illusion or approximation that breaks down under certain conditions, that free will and determinism achieve strange synthesis, where futures that already happened can still be changed, where the past isn't fixed but remains fluid and accessible, where the entire structure of temporal experience that we take for granted, the sense that past is immutable and future is open, might be fundamentally wrong, might be limited perception that fails to capture how time actually functions at the deepest level of physical law, leaving us to wonder whether CTCs remain purely mathematical curiosities that physical constraints prevent from existing in reality, or whether they might actually occur in extreme astrophysical conditions, or might be engineerable by sufficiently advanced civilizations. And if they exist or can be created, what dark implications follow from the possibility of causal loops, of events that cause themselves, of information or matter traveling backward through time to alter the conditions that produced them, creating logical paradoxes that either must be resolved through exotic physics, like the many worlds interpretation, or that might prove that time travel, despite being mathematically permitted, is physically impossible for reasons we don't yet understand, leaving closed time-like curves as the most disturbing prediction of general relativity, the feature of space-time geometry that suggests everything we believe about cause and effect and temporal progression might be parochial and incomplete, valid only in the limited regions of space-time we've experienced, breaking down in circumstances we haven't encountered, but that physics says should be possible. Waiting perhaps in the cores of rotating black holes, or in the wakes of infinitely long rotating cylinders, or in space-time configurations that advanced technology might create, waiting to demonstrate that time is not what we think it is, that the past remains accessible, that causality forms loops rather than chains, and that the implications of these facts are darker and stranger than science fiction has adequately explored, because fictional time travel assumes narrative coherence and resolution, assumes that paradoxes will be avoided or resolved through clever plotting, while actual closed time-like curves, as described by physics, suggest that reality might simply be paradoxical, might contain causal structures that violate logic, might permit situations where effects precede causes, and where the entire notion of temporal ordering becomes meaningless or ambiguous, leaving us uncertain whether we should hope that CTCs remain impossible despite mathematical permission, or whether their existence would reveal truths about reality's structure that are currently hidden from us by the limitations of our experience and our conception of how time must work. The mathematical foundation is solid. Kurt Gödel, Einstein's colleague at the Institute for Advanced Study, discovered in 1949 that the equations of general relativity permit a universe that rotates, and that in such a universe, closed time-like curves would exist, paths that loop back to their temporal starting point. Einstein was disturbed by this solution because it suggested his theory might allow violations of causality, though Gödel argued that the solution simply revealed something true about time that our intuitions had missed, that the possibility of returning to the past demonstrated that time isn't fundamentally different from space, that the flow of time we experience is subjective rather than objective, that the universe itself is a four-dimensional block where past, present, and future coexist eternally, and the distinction between them is merely perspectival. The Gödel universe doesn't match observations. Our universe doesn't appear to rotate in the way his solution requires. But the existence of the solution proves that general relativity permits CTCs under at least some conditions, establishing that time travel to the past isn't forbidden by the fundamental laws of physics, even if the specific conditions required don't obtain in our actual universe. This opened the question of whether other solutions, perhaps more physically realistic, might also permit CTCs. The Tipler cylinder is another CTC solution. Proposed by physicist Frank Tipler in 1974, it involves an infinitely long cylinder of dense matter radiating at speeds approaching light speed. Space-time around such an object would be dragged into rotation by frame-dragging effects, and sufficiently close to the cylinder, this space-time rotation would become so extreme that closed time-like curves would form, allowing travelers who follow the appropriate paths around the cylinder to return to their temporal starting point. The practical problems are insurmountable: infinite length, enormous density, relativistic rotation speeds. But the solution proves that CTCs aren't limited to exotic universe-scale configurations, like Gödel's rotating cosmos, that they could in principle exist around specific objects if those objects have the right properties. Rotating black holes, described by the Kerr metric, also contain CTCs in their interior regions. The singularity inside a rotating black hole isn't a point, but a ring. And the space-time geometry in the region inside this ring, singularity permits closed time-like curves. Travelers who somehow survived crossing the event horizon and the inner Cauchy horizon could in principle navigate these CTCs, traveling backward in time. Of course, the tidal forces and radiation would destroy any physical traveler, and the Cauchy horizon is likely unstable in ways that prevent CTCs from actually being traversable. But the mathematical solution exists, demonstrating that CTCs aren't just exotic theoretical possibilities, but might exist inside astronomical objects that actually occur in nature, though in regions that are effectively inaccessible and almost certainly lethal. The wormhole scenarios that Carl Sagan popularized and that Kip Thorne analyzed rigorously can also create CTCs under certain conditions. If you create a wormhole connecting two regions of space, then accelerate one mouth of the wormhole to near light speed while leaving the other stationary, time dilation effects will cause the two mouths to experience time at different rates. Eventually, the traveling mouth will be in the past relative to the stationary mouth, and traversing the wormhole would allow time travel to the past. The practical and theoretical problems are enormous. Wormholes require exotic matter with negative energy density to remain stable, and any attempt to create a CTC through wormhole manipulation might be prevented by quantum effects that destroy the wormhole, or by still unknown physical principles that forbid time machines, even when the mathematics allows them. But the possibility exists within known physics, demonstrating that time travel might be achievable through engineering, rather than requiring discovery of natural CTCs. The paradoxes are where the dark implications emerge. The grandfather paradox is most famous. You travel back in time and kill your grandfather before he had children, preventing your own birth, which means you never existed to travel back in time, which means your grandfather lived and had children, which means you were born and traveled back to kill him, creating an infinite logical loop with no consistent resolution. The bootstrap paradox is equally troubling. Information or objects that have no origin, that exist only because they were brought back from the future to the past, where they were eventually brought forward to the future. A book containing advanced physics brought back in time and given to a young scientist who studies it, makes the discoveries it contains, and eventually writes the very book that will be brought back to him. But where did the information in the book originally come from? It exists in a causal loop with no external source, no creative origin, information that has always existed in the loop, but that was never actually created by anyone. The possible resolutions to these paradoxes reveal the dark implications. The Novikov self-consistency principle proposes that time travel is only possible if the actions of travelers don't create paradoxes, that the universe somehow enforces consistency, preventing any action that would alter the past in ways that contradict what already happened. In this framework, free will for time travelers becomes limited or illusory. You can travel to the past, but you can't change it, because any action you attempt will turn out to have already been part of the history you remember, will be prevented or will fail, or will have unexpected consequences that preserve consistency. Your attempts to kill your grandfather will fail. The gun will jam, or you'll miss, or you'll kill the wrong person, or you'll discover the man you thought was your grandfather wasn't actually your biological ancestor. The universe conspires to maintain consistency, making the past effectively immutable, even when you're physically present in it. This resolution is dark because it implies predetermination, cosmic censorship of possibilities, a universe where certain actions are simply impossible, not because of lack of power or capability, but because they would violate causal consistency. It suggests that physics contains built-in constraints on action that operate at a level beyond human comprehension, that free will is limited by temporal consistency requirements that prevent paradox. You can travel in time, but you can't actually change anything, making the entire enterprise futile, making you a prisoner of consistency, even as you move through the timeline. The many worlds interpretation provides a different resolution. When you travel back and kill your grandfather, the universe splits. The timeline you came from continues to exist with you having been born and having traveled back. But your action creates a new branch, a parallel timeline where your grandfather dies and you're never born in that branch. The paradox is avoided because there are now two separate realities, and causal consistency is maintained within each, even though they're incompatible with each other. But this resolution is dark in different ways. It means you can never return to your origin timeline. That backward time travel is actually travel to parallel worlds, that you're irreversibly separated from everything you knew, exiled to a timeline where you might not exist, and where your actions have consequences you can't escape by returning home, because your home timeline is now permanently inaccessible. Exists in superposition state that you've decohered from through your time travel action. Another possibility is that quantum effects prevent CTCS from being traversable, even when they exist mathematically. Hawking proposed the chronology protection conjecture, suggesting that quantum mechanics contains principles that prevent time machines from being created, that whenever space-time configuration approaches creating a CTC, quantum vacuum fluctuations or other quantum processes generate diverging effects that prevent the CTC from forming or make it untraversable. The universe protects causality through quantum mechanisms we don't fully understand, ensuring that while CTCs might exist mathematically and might even form temporarily, they can never actually be used for time travel, preserving temporal ordering at the fundamental level. This is dark because it means the mathematics of general relativity permits time travel, but reality forbids it through additional constraints that we haven't discovered yet, that our understanding of physics is incomplete in ways that specifically relate to causality and temporal structure, that there are deep principles governing time that we're missing, that the universe has built-in protection against paradox that operates through mechanisms we don't comprehend. It means causality is more fundamental than space-time geometry, that there are laws beyond Einstein's equations that prevent the most disturbing implications of general relativity from being realized. If CTCs do exist and are traversable, if time travel to the past is physically possible, the implications extend beyond paradoxes to questions about the nature of time itself. The block universe interpretation suggests that past, present, and future all exist simultaneously in the four-dimensional space-time manifold, that the flow of time is illusion created by consciousness, experiencing space-time sequentially, rather than all at once. CTCS support this interpretation because they suggest time is just another dimension like space, that traveling through time is geometrically equivalent to traveling through space, that the distinction we make between past and future is anthropocentric rather than fundamental to physics. But this means everything that will ever happen has in some sense already happened, that the future exists just as concretely as the past, that free will is either illusory or operates in ways we don't understand, that the open future we believe we're creating through our choices already exists as determined fact in the block universe, making choice and agency mysterious or impossible. If the future exists and can be visited via CTCs, then it's fixed, then everything is predetermined, then the sense of possibilities and potential is false, is just ignorance of what's already actualized in the complete four-dimensional structure of space-time. The question of whether we're already living in a universe that contains time travelers from the future is disturbing to contemplate. If CTCs are possible, if advanced civilizations or future humans have access to time travel technology, they might be present in our current time, observing or influencing events, creating the very history we're experiencing. Every mysterious event, every unexplained phenomenon, every moment where causality seems ambiguous or where coincidences seem too perfect might involve time travelers ensuring certain outcomes, preventing certain disasters, guiding history along paths that lead to the futures they come from. The absence of obvious time travelers might mean time travel is impossible, or might mean travelers are careful to avoid detection, or might mean we can't recognize them because they appear as ordinary people, or might mean the Novikov principle prevents actions that would make time travel obvious because such actions would create paradoxes. The lack of evidence for time travelers could be evidence that chronology protection works, or could be evidence that time travelers are successfully hiding, or could be evidence that we don't know what to look for, that time travelers don't match our expectations of what they'd be like. If you could travel backward in time, the ethical implications are staggering. Do you have obligation to prevent atrocities you know will occur? Do you have right to change history for what you believe is the better, imposing your values on alternate timeline? If you prevent a disaster, what unintended consequences ripple forward from that change? The people who would have been born in the original timeline won't exist in the altered one. People who wouldn't have existed in the original timeline will exist in the changed version. Are you committing genocide and creation simultaneously? The moral weight of changing history, of having that power, of deciding which version of events should be real, is beyond anything human ethics has developed frameworks for addressing. The possibility that CTCs exist naturally or could be engineered by advanced civilizations suggests that causality, as we experience it, might be local and approximate, valid only in the limited regions of space-time we inhabit, breaking down in extreme conditions where the full implications of general relativity manifest. We live our lives assuming the past is fixed and the future is open, assuming causes precede effects, assuming time flows forward uniformly. But physics suggests these assumptions might be wrong, might be convenient fictions that work only because we're far from CTCS, because we exist in regions of space-time where temporal ordering is clear and paradoxes don't arise. What happens if we encounter a region where time loops, where effects precede causes, where the comfortable assumptions break down? What happens to consciousness if it experiences nonlinear time, if it traverses a CTC and encounters its own past? Does identity remain coherent across causal loops? Can consciousness process experiencing events in order different from their causal sequence? The psychological implications of time travel might be as profound as the physical implications, might reveal that human consciousness is fundamentally adapted to linear time and can't function properly when that linearity is violated. Closed time-like curves represent the point where general relativity produces results so counterintuitive and so disturbing that even physicists who work with the mathematics regularly have divided opinions about what they mean. Some believe CTCs prove that time travel is possible, and we simply haven't discovered how to engineer it yet. Others believe CTCs prove that general relativity is incomplete, that a complete theory of quantum gravity will eliminate CTC solutions and restore causal sanity. Others believe CTCs are possible, but quantum chronology protection makes them untraversable. Others embrace the implications, accept that time might really be circular in some circumstances, that causality might really be looser than we thought, that the universe might really permit logical paradoxes and information that has no origin. The mathematics is clear. The implications are dark. The reality remains uncertain. Whether closed time-like curves exist only on paper, or whether they exist in physical reality, whether they could be engineered or discovered, whether they permit actual time travel, or whether quantum effects prevent their traversal, whether paradoxes are avoided through many worlds splitting, or through Novikov consistency, or through mechanisms we haven't discovered. These questions remain among the most profound in theoretical physics, among the most disturbing in their implications for causality and consciousness and free will and the nature of time itself, leaving us uncertain whether to hope that time travel remains impossible despite mathematical permission, or whether its possibility would reveal truths about reality's structure that would be worth the price of losing the comfortable fiction that time flows forward linearly, that the past is fixed and the future is open, that causality operates in the straightforward way our intuition suggests, when closed time-like curves whisper that maybe time is stranger than that, maybe causality loops, maybe the future influences the past, maybe everything we think we know about temporal ordering is wrong, is local approximation, is convenient lie that works only because we're trapped in regions of space-time where time appears to flow linearly, where CTCs don't exist or can't be accessed, leaving us with equations that permit time travel and with universe that might or might not allow what the equations describe, with dark implications that follow from the possibility that we could travel backward, could encounter our past selves, could create paradoxes that either can't be resolved, or that resolve in ways that violate everything we believe about choice and causality, and the forward flow of time that we've assumed was fundamental. But that general relativity suggests is merely typical, merely the pattern we experience in our corner of space-time. Maybe breaking down elsewhere, maybe breaking down in conditions we could create if we understood enough, maybe already breaking down in astronomical objects we can't directly observe, in the interiors of rotating black holes where CTCs might actually exist, where time loops back on itself, where cause and effect become circular, where the dark implications of closed time-like curves stop being theoretical and become actual features of reality. Features that, if we ever access them or encounter them, would force us to confront that time is not what we thought, that causality is not what we assumed, that the universe permits loops and paradoxes and time travel and all the disturbing implications that follow, leaving us hoping perhaps that chronology protection works, that quantum effects prevent CTCs from being traversable, that the universe protects itself from paradox, that time travel remains impossible despite being mathematically permitted. Because the alternative, that we could actually travel backward, actually change the past, actually create the paradoxes that break logic and causality, is darker than most science fiction has explored. is implication of general relativity, that even physicists who work with the mathematics every day sometimes wish wasn't there. Wish could be eliminated by additional physics we haven't discovered yet. Wish would turn out to be mathematical artifact rather than physical possibility. But that remains in the equations, remains as prediction of our best theory of space-time and gravity, remains as the dark secret at the heart of general relativity. The disturbing implication that time might not be what we think it is, that closed time-like curves might actually exist, and that if they do, everything we believe about causality and temporal progression and the impossibility of changing the past might be wrong, might be limited perspective, might be comfortable illusion that shatters when confronted with the full implications of physics, with the loops and paradoxes and time travel that general relativity permits, that mathematics describes, that reality might actually contain. Waiting perhaps in extreme conditions we haven't encountered, waiting perhaps to be discovered or engineered, waiting to prove that time is circular, that causality loops, that the dark implications of closed time-like curves are not just abstract mathematical curiosities, but actual features of the universe we inhabit. Features we simply haven't accessed yet because we lack the technology, or because we exist far from the extreme conditions where space-time's curvature permits the impossible, permits the past to be reached from the future, permits time travel and all its paradoxes and all its dark implications for everything we think we know about. How reality works and how time flows, and whether the past can be changed, and whether the future already exists, and whether free will is possible if causality forms loops instead of chains, leaving closed time-like curves as the most disturbing feature of our best physics. The prediction we hope is wrong, but that mathematics says is right. The dark implication that won't go away no matter how much we wish it would, that remains embedded in general relativity, that remains possible, that remains waiting. The midnight game, a ritual that opens doors to something dark. There are games that aren't really games, rituals disguised as entertainment, procedures that present themselves as folklore or urban legend, but that might actually work, that might actually open connections to things that exist outside normal reality. The midnight game is one of these, a set of instructions that circulates online and through whispered conversations, rules for summoning something that the ritual simply calls the Midnight Man. Those who've attempted it and survived describe an experience that transcends ordinary fear. Hours spent in darkness being hunted by a presence that shouldn't exist, that manifests through cold spots and hallucinations and the overwhelming certainty that something is in the house with you, something that wants very badly to catch you, and that if it succeeds, the consequences extend far beyond the temporary terror of a game gone wrong. The ritual is supposedly an old pagan punishment for breaking rules, a way to confront wrongdoers with their darkest fears and deepest guilt. But whether it originates in ancient practice or modern invention, those who perform it correctly report results that suggest they've actually summoned something, that the game works, that some doors really do open when you follow the right procedures at the right time with the right intention. The instructions are specific and must be followed exactly. You need a candle, matches, a piece of paper with your full name written on it, a pin or needle to draw blood, a wooden door in your home, and the courage or stupidity to begin the ritual precisely at midnight. You write your name on the paper, prick your finger to place a drop of blood on the written name, then position the paper against the wooden door. You knock on the door 22 times, with the final knock landing exactly at midnight. Not a second before, not a second after, but precisely as the clock transitions from 11:59 to 12. Then you open the door, light the candle using only a match, blow out the match immediately, close the door, and relight the candle. At this point, if you've done everything correctly, the Midnight Man is in your home and the game has begun. The rules for survival are simple but absolute. You must keep the candle lit while moving through your house in complete darkness until 3:33 a.m. If the candle goes out, you have 10 seconds to relight it using only matches. If you can't relight it within that window, you must immediately surround yourself with a circle of salt and remain inside until 3:33 a.m. You cannot turn on any lights. You cannot leave your home. You cannot speak to anyone or attempt to communicate what's happening. You must simply endure, moving through the darkness with only candlelight to protect you, while the Midnight Man hunts you through your own home for 3.5 hours. What happens during those hours is where the ritual transforms from procedure into nightmare. Players report temperature drops so severe they can see their breath despite it being summer, cold, that has no natural source, and that seems to focus on specific locations in the house, moving from room to room as if the presence is searching, hunting, trying to locate where you're hiding. The candle flame behaves strangely, flickering violently when there's no air current, dimming to almost nothing, and then flaring bright, sometimes pointing in specific directions as if being pulled or pushed by force that surrounds it. And then the candle goes out, not from wind or accident, but simply extinguishes itself, and you're plunged into absolute darkness with 10 seconds to find matches and relight it before something happens that the rules never specify, but that everyone understands will be very, very bad. Those who failed to relight the candle in time and didn't have salt available describe experiences that defy comfortable explanation. Hallucinations, they try to tell themselves afterward. Just fear and darkness creating sensory distortions. But the hallucinations know things they shouldn't know. They speak in voices of people from your past. They reference memories you've tried to forget. They manifest as your deepest fears given visual form and physical presence. One player described seeing her childhood bedroom materialize in her living room, complete with the bed where she used to hide from her abusive father, and then watching her father's shadow appear on the wall, growing larger as if approaching, while a voice that sounded exactly like his whispered her name the way he used to before coming into her room. Another reported the walls seeming to bleed, running with liquid that looked like blood but smelled like something chemical and wrong, while hands pressed against the walls from the inside as if trying to push through, as if something was trapped in the structure of the house and trying to break into the space where he stood. The psychological dimension is where the Midnight Game reveals its true nature. It doesn't just scare you, it knows you. The presence that manifests seems to have access to your memory, your guilt, your shame, your trauma. It weaponizes your own consciousness against you, pulling out the things you've buried or denied and forcing you to confront them in darkness while being hunted. People report hearing their own voice speaking from corners of rooms, saying things they've thought but never vocalized, confessing to actions they've kept secret, revealing aspects of themselves they've worked hard to hide from others and from themselves. The ritual becomes therapy at knife point, psychological excavation conducted by something that cares nothing for your well-being, that wants only to expose every vulnerability and see how you respond when your defenses are stripped away. There are also physical effects that survivors struggle to explain. Scratches appearing on skin with no obvious source, as if invisible claws have raked across exposed flesh. Bruises in the shape of handprints in places where no one touched them. Objects moving in the darkness, falling from shelves, or sliding across floors when no one is near them. Doors opening or closing on their own, sometimes slowly, as if something is carefully pushing them, sometimes slamming with force that shakes the walls. The environment becomes actively hostile, the familiar space of your home transformed into a maze where physics doesn't quite work right, and where the darkness itself feels solid, pressing against you, trying to smother the candlelight that's your only protection. The salt circle, if you're forced to use it, becomes a prison. You're trapped inside a boundary approximately 3 feet in diameter, unable to move or leave for hours, while the Midnight Man circles outside. Players who've resorted to this describe the worst experience of their lives, not because of what they see, but because of what they feel. The presence standing just outside the salt, so close they can sense it, radiating cold and hunger and malevolent attention. They hear breathing that isn't their own. They feel air movement as if something is leaning in close, examining them, trying to find a way through the barrier. Time distorts inside the circle, minutes feeling like hours, the wait until 3:33. Shatter, stretching into subjective eternity while they crouch in the small space, gripping matches and candle, praying that the salt actually works, that it will hold until the game ends. Then at 3:33 a.m. exactly, everything stops. The presence withdraws as if it never existed. The temperature returns to normal. The candle flame behaves naturally. The oppressive feeling of being watched and hunted simply vanishes, like a switch being flipped. The game is over, and if you've survived, if you've kept the candle lit, or stayed within the salt circle until the appointed time, you've won. But winning doesn't feel like victory. It feels like you've been released, like something had you and chose to let go because the time limit specified in the ritual has been reached. Not because you beat it, but because rules that predate your understanding dictate that 3:33 a.m. is when the game ends. The aftermath is where many players realize they've made a terrible mistake. Sleep becomes difficult or impossible for days afterward. Dreams, when they come, are saturated with imagery from the ritual. Memories of what happened in the darkness, replaying with variations that make them worse. Some report continued presence, a sense that the Midnight Man didn't fully leave, that something from those 3.5 hours followed them out of the game and now resides somewhere in their consciousness or their environment. Objects move when they're not looking. Shadows appear that have no source. They hear knocking, 22 knocks exactly, coming from doors in their home at random times, and the terror that surges when they hear it is primal and absolute, because part of them believes that counting has invited it back, that the game might begin again without their consent. There are accounts that are more disturbing, stories of people who attempted the midnight game and were never quite the same afterward, whose personality shifted in subtle but noticeable ways. Family members describe them as more withdrawn, more paranoid, speaking occasionally about being watched or followed by something they can't see but can always feel. Some develop obsessive behaviors around salt, needing to keep it in every room, creating protective circles they sit inside when they sleep. Others become nocturnal, unable to be in their homes after dark, sleeping during the day and spending nights in public spaces where people and lights provide protection from something they can't explain to anyone who didn't experience the game. The skeptical explanation is straightforward. You're putting yourself in a highly suggestible state through ritual, then subjecting yourself to hours alone in darkness, while primed to expect terrifying experiences. Your own mind generates the hallucinations. Your own fear creates the sensory distortions. Your own guilt and shame provide the content that manifests as the presence knowing your secrets. It's self-induced psychological torture, frightening yourself in ways that bypass rational thinking by following procedures that feel ancient and powerful, even if they're actually modern invention. The ritual works because belief makes it work, because your brain creates the experiences you've been primed to expect. But this explanation struggles with certain observations. Why do multiple people performing the ritual in different locations with no communication between them report such consistent experiences? The temperature drops in specific patterns. The candle behavior follows predictable stages. The manifestations, while personalized to each player's fears, follow similar progressions. Auditory first, then visual, then physical. If it's purely psychological, purely each individual's imagination, why the consistency? And why do environmental effects persist after the ritual ends? Unexplained scratches, moved objects, recordings made during the game that capture sounds the player didn't hear while it was happening, evidence that something occurred beyond internal hallucination. There are also the failures, cases where people attempted the ritual but did something wrong. Started a minute late, used the wrong kind of candle, wrote their name incompletely, and reported that nothing happened. They spent 3.5 hours in darkness with a candle and experienced only boredom and disappointment. If the terror is purely psychological, why would precise adherence to arbitrary rules matter? Why would starting at 12:01 instead of midnight produce completely different results? Unless the rules aren't arbitrary, unless they're actually instructions for a procedure that only works when performed correctly, when specific conditions are met that allow something to manifest or cross over, or gain temporary access to physical space. The origin of the ritual is disputed and unclear. Some claim it's an old pagan practice mentioned in folklore from various European traditions as punishment for wrongdoing. Others trace it to more recent sources, internet horror stories that developed their own life and began circulating as if they were authentic ancient rites. The uncertainty about origin doesn't change the reported effects, but it raises questions about how rituals work. If the midnight game is modern invention, if someone created it as fiction and it only later began producing real effects, what does that mean? Can belief and repeated performance give power to procedures that had none originally? Can enough people following instructions create an egregore, a thought form that becomes real through accumulated psychic energy, that begins to respond when summoned, even though it didn't exist before the ritual was conceived? There's also the question of what the Midnight Man actually is. The ritual doesn't explain, doesn't provide mythology or backstory. It simply tells you that you're summoning something and gives you rules for surviving the encounter. Is it a demon, an entity from traditional demonology that responds to this particular summoning method? Is it an interdimensional being that the ritual temporarily pulls into our reality? Is it a manifestation of your own shadow self, the Jungian dark aspects of psyche given temporary autonomous form through the ritual framework? Or is it something without analog in existing classification systems, something that exists because the ritual exists, that was called into being by the belief and fear of those who perform the game? The fact that it ends at 3:33 a.m. is significant to some researchers. The number 3 repeated has occult significance in various traditions. It's also exactly 3.5 hours after midnight, a time span that appears in other rituals and spiritual practices as having meaning related to consciousness and dimensional boundaries. Some suggest that 3:33 a.m. represents a moment when barriers thin, when whatever was summoned at midnight must return to wherever it came from because the window of accessibility closes. This would mean the ritual isn't giving you the power to banish the presence, but is simply exploiting a natural cycle, summoning something during a period when it can manifest, and then relying on cosmic timing to ensure it withdraws. Those who've researched the game warn strongly against performing it. They note that even if the experience is just psychological, the psychological damage can be severe and lasting. Fear that intense, sustained over hours does things to the nervous system and brain chemistry that don't easily reverse. But their warnings carry an additional weight, a suggestion that they believe something more than psychology is involved, that they've seen evidence or heard accounts that convince them the ritual actually works as advertised, that it opens doors that should remain closed, and summons attention from things that are better left unaware of your existence. There are also rumors about variations, about people who've modified the ritual, using different numbers of knocks, performing it at different times, altering the rules for survival, and produced different results, summoned different things, or the same thing in more powerful form. These experimental approaches are condemned by those familiar with the original game as stupidly dangerous, playing with forces you don't understand by changing parameters that were established for reasons you can't know. If the original rules keep you relatively safe within the game's structure, modifying them might remove those protections while still opening whatever door the ritual creates, leaving you exposed to something that no longer has to follow the constraints that governed the standard version. The Midnight game persists in online spaces and real-world practice because it offers something that ordinary life doesn't. Direct encounter with the numinous, with something that feels genuinely other, that produces experiences beyond what normal consciousness accesses. People are drawn to it despite warnings, despite fear, because the world has been disenchanted, and they crave proof that reality is stranger than the materialist worldview allows. They want to know that magic works, that rituals have power, that there are doors that can be opened into spaces and states that transcend ordinary existence. And the Midnight game delivers that knowledge, though the cost is higher than most. Anticipate when they light that first match at midnight and knock 22 times on a door that's about to open onto hours. They'll never forget. Hours that will teach them definitively that some games aren't entertainment, some rituals actually function as advertised, and that the darkness in your home at night might contain things that are waiting for permission to manifest, waiting for you to speak the right words, or perform the right actions, or follow the right procedures that allow them temporary access to the space where you live, where they can hunt you for sport, or punishment, or purposes you'll never understand, held back only by rules written in procedures. You must follow perfectly if you hope to survive until 3:33 a.m., when whatever you've invited into your life finally, mercifully, returns to wherever it came from, until someone else somewhere lights a candle at midnight and knocks 22 times, beginning the game again.